Before we begin, I thought it would be fun if everyone lets me know in the comments where they're watching this video from. And while you're down there, don't forget to subscribe. Now let's start today's episode. Alex Cooper. Alex Cooper, a 65-year-old man from Cranbrook, British Columbia, had been married to Margaret since 1952. Together, they had 5 children and 7 grandchildren. Alex was a beloved husband and family man who cherished spending time with his loved ones and playing music. From 1974 to 1986, Alex worked in the cleaning industry before transitioning to a career as a salesman, which required him to travel frequently, sometimes spending several days away from his family. On the morning of April 4, 1987, Alex's daughter Lila and her husband Pete left Cranbrook for a shopping trip. As they passed the bridge, they noticed Alex's car parked by the side of the road. They decided to stop and check on him, assuming he was fishing by the river. However, when they reached the riverbank, there was no sign of Alex. Lila grew worried due to her father's heart condition and called her mother, Margaret, who revealed that she hadn't seen Alex in over 24 hours. They called several hospitals, but he had not checked into any of them. The family then called the police to report Alex missing. Investigators found that his car was locked. Inside was clothing and fishing equipment. An extensive air and land search then began, but no trace of Alex was found. Investigators then decided to try and find out where was Alex last seen. They found that he ate lunch at a restaurant less than a mile from where his car was found. Margaret told investigators that Alex always paid with a large roll of cash. She believed that someone saw all of the money he was carrying around and robbed him and took his life. Lila, on the other hand, believed had Alex went down to the river, had a heart attack, fell in and drowned. Before I continue, I want to remind you that only a small percentage of people who watch my videos are actually subscribed. So if you enjoy my content, consider subscribing. It's free and you can always change your mind later. Now let's move on with the video. Newspapers and television broadcasts picked up Alex's story. This led to witnesses coming forward. They had seen a man matching Alex's description hitchhiking in the area his car was found. This made investigators believe had Alex wanted to disappear. His family did not believe that is the case, as he was a devoted family man. It would also not make a lot of sense for him to leave his hard medication and credit cards at home. A year after Alex was last seen, Margaret started to look for Alex's birth certificate. She discovered that there was no certificate issued in his name. She could also find no record of Alex Cooper prior to their marriage in 1952. This left the Cooper family in a constant state of uncertainty. Then on May 27, 1991, another shock came to the family. Halfway across the country in Toronto, another man went missing. This man was also a traveling salesman. His name was David Cooper. David had been living in a boarding house for approximately a year. He sold meat products to families over the phone. During one of his business trips, a friend of his reported him missing. When investigators looked inside his room, they found a photo of him holding his grandchild. Investigators believed that David Cooper looked a lot like Alex Cooper. They showed a photo to Alex's family, and they were able to confirm that Alex and David was the same man. On May 29, 1991, Alex went to his room after his business trip. He noticed that someone was there while he was away. He called his landlady, and she told him that she had to open for investigators. When the police went back to the room a few days later, Alex was already gone. Investigators and Alex's family believed that something must have happened in his past which made him have to disappear. On September 25, 1991, Alex's case was featured on Unsolved Mysteries. A viewer from Hamilton, Canada, recognized Alex and contacted the police. Investigators traced him to Hamilton, where he revealed that his true name was Albin Arsenault. In 1948, at the age of 26, he had worked for the Union Pacific Railroad and was accused of theft. Fearing arrest for a crime he didn't commit, Albin changed his name to Alex Cooper and, 4 years later, married Margaret. When he reached the age of 65, he realized that without the proper documentation, he would be unable to receive a pension. Unable to confess the truth to his family after years of deceit, he chose to disappear instead. Moving on to the next case. Alfred Packer. Alfred Packer, born on January 21, 1842, also known as Alfred Packer, was one of 3 children of James Packer and Esla Greiner. The family relocated from Pennsylvania to LaGrange County, Indiana, in the early 1850s, where James worked as a cabinet maker. Alfred, who had a strained relationship with his parents, left home in his late teens and began working as a shoemaker in Minnesota. He enlisted in the Civil War twice, first in April 1862, where he served for 8 months, and again in June 1863, remaining until April 1864. Both times, he was discharged due to his epilepsy, which caused him to have seizures up to twice a day. Over the next 9 years, Alfred held various jobs, including a hunter and a ranch hand. However, due to his epilepsy and poor attitude, he struggled to maintain stable employment or a consistent income. Many considered Alfred to be either kind nor hardworking, and he was generally disliked and distrusted by those around him. Alfred was described as argumentative, petty, and generally unpleasant, which likely contributed to his difficulty in securing long-term employment. He reportedly even worked as a guide, but those who knew him said he had a tendency to get lost, making the job ill-suited for him. Alfred later tried his hand at mining jobs in Colorado and Utah but found no success there either. However, in November 1873, everything changed when Alfred encountered a group of 20 men traveling from the Bingham County mines near Salt Lake City, Utah, to Breckenridge, Colorado. Word of a gold discovery in Colorado had spread quickly, prompting the men to head there in search of wealth. They met Alfred about 25 miles from the start of their journey. According to one of the men, George Tracy, Alfred asked where they were headed and if he could join them. Though the group was initially hesitant to include him due to his lack of supplies and money, Alfred convinced them that he was an experienced guide and could lead the way, claiming to have extensive knowledge of the land. The group initially thought Alfred could be a helpful and valuable member, but things quickly went awry when it became clear that he had no knowledge of the terrain they were crossing. The other men described him as greedy and lazy, and his seizures became a significant liability, causing the journey to Colorado to drag on far longer than anticipated. Their progress was minimal, and with the season growing late, the worsening winter weather made things even harder. As their situation worsened, the horses and wagons got stuck, and their supplies eventually ran out. In desperation, the men resorted to eating the horses' feed to stay alive. After nearly 2 months of hardship, they finally found a glimmer of hope. On January 21, 1874, they stumbled upon the camp of Chief Ouray, the Native American leader of the Tabawash band of the Ute tribe in Colorado. Chief Ouray, known for his exceptional leadership skills, had caught the attention of U.S. officials and spent much of his life working to establish peaceful treaties with settlers and the government. With his reputation as a man of peace, Alfred and his group sought his assistance. When they arrived at the camp, they looked frail and disheveled, which frightened some members of the tribe. However, Chief Ouray, true to his character, welcomed them warmly, providing them with food and shelter. Understanding the land and the harsh winter conditions, the chief advised them to delay their journey to the gold mines until the spring. He offered to feed and shelter them throughout the winter if they chose to wait. While some of the men were content to wait for better conditions, others feared that by the time they reached the mines, there would be nothing left. In February, after taking some time to recover and prepare, 11 members of the group decided they wanted to continue on. Chief Ouray, seeing their determination, provided them with provisions and gave them directions on how to safely navigate the challenging path ahead. He advised them to follow the river and avoid the mountains. Although this route would take longer, it would offer a much safer journey. Dissatisfied with the longer route suggested by Chief Ouray, Alfred proposed a more direct path for the group. He convinced 5 men to follow him, while the remaining 5 opted to take the safer route. Those who chose the safer path faced harsh weather conditions and were eventually found nearly starving by workers at a government cattle camp near Gunnison, Colorado, where they stayed until April. On February 9th, Alfred and his 5 followers set out from the camp. Initially, they followed the river, but eventually veered onto a winding trail that led them into the San Juan Mountains. This decision was made hastily as they began to run low on food. The group lacked adequate clothing, snowshoes, and had run out of matches, with no flint to start fires. They believed that the sooner they reached the mountains, the sooner they would reach their destination, but this proved to be a fatal miscalculation. In fact, Alfred was the only one to make it out of those mountains alive. On April 16, 1874, he emerged from the woods alone. There was no trace of the other members of his party: Shannon Wilson Bell, James Humphrey, Frank Miller, George Noon, and Israel Swan. The 32-year-old Alfred made his way across a frozen lake bed to the Los Pinos Indian Agency near Soik, Colorado. With rags wrapped around his feet, he stumbled into the building, pleading for food and shelter. The agency staff provided him with food, but Alfred vomited everything he ate, explaining that his digestive system had been altered due to prolonged near starvation. Over the years, Alfred gave multiple versions of what happened in the San Juan Mountains. One account he shared with the agency staff was that he'd been hired as a guide by the group of 5, but had become snowblind and been abandoned. He claimed that Israel Swan, the eldest member of the group at 65, had given him his rifle for protection before continuing on without him. Alfred claimed that he survived on little more than rosebuds and roots as he struggled to find his way back to civilization. However, the agency men noticed something odd. Despite his story, Alfred didn't appear to be a man who had been starving for 2 months. He seemed relatively healthy. They didn't dwell on this observation and allowed Alfred to stay at the agency for 10 days before he told them he intended to return to Pennsylvania. Before leaving to gather supplies for the trip home, Alfred sold Israel Swan's rifle for $10.02, equivalent to about $24 today, claiming he urgently needed the money. In the nearby town of Swatch, Alfred rented a room in Dolan's saloon, owned by a man named Larry Dolan. Larry later stated that Alfred spent about $100 during his stay, which would be around $2,249 in today's money. Alfred even offered to lend Larry $300. Additionally, he spent $178 at the general store and was seen using different wallets. Throughout his time in town, Alfred drank heavily and frequently, often sharing conflicting stories about his recent journey. His behavior caught the attention of the townspeople, who eagerly gossiped about him and the strange tales he told. Soon new faces arrived in town. One of them was a man named Preston Nutter, who'd been one of the men to remain at Chief Yor's camp until the spring. Preston encountered Alfred at the saloon and questioned him about where the rest of his party was. The 32-year-old told his tale, explaining that his feet got wet, and as he was drying them by the fire, the other men in the group went off to look for food and never came back. Preston immediately suspected that something was amiss. After all, even if he was a poor guide, he had been the leader and the guide of that group. Why would they leave Alfred behind? He also found it unnecessarily cruel that the men would just go off without him. Preston liked the starved man and wondered how on earth he'd suddenly come into so much money. He also noted that Alfred had Frank Miller's knife, which was explained away as something Alfred had picked up when Frank had stuck it in a tree and left it there. Something just felt off to Preston, and he wasn't the only one to notice. Back at the Indian Agency, the 5 men from the other group who'd left just before Alfred's party did showed up. The head of the agency, a man named General Adams, told them about Alfred's extraordinary story. Immediately, the men told Adams not to believe a word of it and explained that Alfred could not be trusted. They convinced Adams to send an officer to bring Alfred in for questioning. And just as the agency staff member arrived in Saguache to do so, things were heating up between Alfred and Preston, who had brought other men along with him and was ready to confront Alfred about what really happened in the mountains in the last 2 months. Alfred was reluctant to return to the agency but did so. Just before they left, Preston told the agency staff member everything he knew and suspected. Upon returning to the agency, the staff member explained to Adams everything that he had been told by Preston. Meanwhile, Alfred greeted the new arrivals at the agency like old, lost-long friends. Unconvinced by his words, the group demanded to know where the rest of his party was. Alfred told them the same story he had told the agency staff and claimed to be surprised and concerned that they hadn't managed to safely make their way to the agency yet. When asked about how he came by his sudden wealth, Alfred explained that he'd been given a cash loan in sewage. However, an agency staff member who was dispatched to the town to verify this quickly returned to disprove it, and noted that witnesses had seen Alfred with multiple wallets. Suspicion was starting to grow amongst the agency staff, including General Adams, who remained determined to give Alfred the benefit of the doubts. He convened a council made up of the staff, himself, Alfred, and the 5 newly arrived miners so they could all get to the bottom of things and put the matter to rest. But they were interrupted by the horrifying scene of tribesmen entering the agency clutching strips of what they called white man's meat. They found the fleshy strips while hunting on the nearby hill. At the sight of this, Alfred collapsed to the ground and passed out. When he came to again, he began begging for mercy, promising a full confession. After a lengthy silence, he said, quote, "This would not be the first time that people had been obliged to eat each other when they were hungry." In Alfred's first official statement about what took place between February 9th and April 16th, 1874, he explained that the men had quickly exhausted their food supplies due to the rough terrain and the amount of energy required to traverse it. While they did manage to survive on vegetation and rabbit meat for a short time, the cold appeared to drive all the animals away, leaving them hungry. A few days later, upon returning from gathering firewood, he found 4 men from his group standing around the dead body of Israel Swan. He'd been killed via a blow to the head. According to Alfred, he simply accepted this and joined them in butchering the body. They split up his cash among them and Alfred took possession of Israel's rifle. They packed up some body parts for the trip, but again, they found no wildlife as they progressed on their journey. Frank Miller was killed next, again, from a blow to the back of the head. His share of Israel's money was redistributed and Alfred took his knife. James Humphrey was the 3rd victim, followed closely by a young George Noon. Alfred noted in his statement at this point, both he and the remaining man, Shannon Bell, swore on Almighty God that they would do no harm to each other. They vowed to never speak of the cannibalism and agreed they'd say the other men in the group succumbed to the harsh weather. However, despite their promises to each other and to God, things took a vicious turn when the pair camped out one night at a lake. Shannon Bell began screaming that he couldn't take it anymore and that one of them was going to die for food. He lunged at Packer with his rifle ready to bash in his head, but Alfred deflected his ferocious attempts to do so, hitting Shannon in the head with his hatchet. At this point, he claimed his only fear was starving to death. Alfred ate some of Shannon's body, took his money and then packed up some of the meats to take with him. He didn't think he'd survive, and just when he was losing all hope, he stumbled across the agency. Here, Alfred reportedly stated that he developed a taste for human flesh and that he tossed some of the remaining scraps with some hesitancy. Immediately at the close of his tale, the 5 miners from the other party said they did not believe the story. They claimed that Shannon would lay down his life for another. It was then decided that a search party would be made to look for the bodies. It was composed of the 5 miners, an agency clerk, and several agency officers, and Alfred Packer was the guide. But after 2 weeks, no bodies were recovered. The group reached Lake Fork of the Gunnison River when Alfred claimed that he was lost and the area didn't look right. Empty-handed and still without answers, the group turned and headed back. During the return journey, Alfred attempted to murder the agency clerk, a man named Herman Larder, by using a knife he had concealed in his clothing. He was thankfully unsuccessful and was caught, restrained, and arrested. At this point, General Adams, the man who'd always fought to give Alfred Packer the benefits of the doubt, admitted that he was indeed an extremely dangerous man. From here, Alfred was transferred to Saguache and jailed outside of town by the sheriff. This was for his own protection, as word had spread throughout the town of his crimes and locals were keen to take justice into their own hands. During his imprisonment, Alfred withdrew his earlier statements and changed his story. He claimed that a blizzard had caused them to get lost and that, as he'd said in his previous statements, wildlife eluded them once they ran out of provisions. From here, the men began roasting and eating their shoes. At this point, they made a pact where if one man died, The others would consume their bodies so they would not starve. Israel Swan again was the first to pass. This time his demise came not from the hands of the others, but from hunger and exposure to the elements. Alfred signed this confession. And although it was not his first, it was the first one that he signed. Several months passed and spring folded into summer. The harsh and bitter cold replaced by milder days and plentiful sunlight. It was this change in weather that finally revealed the location of the bodies of the missing men. In August of 1874, an illustrator for a magazine stumbled upon the gruesome scene. All 5 bodies were lying at the foots of Slumgolian Pass, 2 miles southeast of Lake City, Colorado, in a pine-shaded gulch. The group had been within a very easy walking distance of the nearby city had they chosen to follow the lake rather than ascend the mountains. After sketching the scene, the illustrator contacted the authorities. The 5 men were believed to have faced extreme violence, with all of them having been bludgeoned to death. Israel Swan was little more than bones, while Frank Miller was missing his head. The remaining bodies had skeletal legs and intact faces, their bodies rotting away. The discovery of the bodies raised many more questions for Alfred Packer to answer, and right away the agency staff and other miners spotted the inconsistencies in his multiple stories. Firstly, Alfred said the men were killed in different areas, but here they were all in one place. Secondly, both James Humphrey and George Noon had plenty of flesh left on their bodies that could have easily been eaten before Shannon devolved into a starved lunatic. Thirdly, a shelter had been built nearby that had the men's possessions inside and had clearly been used by Alfred during his time alone in the mountains. A well-trodden path between the shelter and the bodies could be seen. Evidence on the scene suggested that the deaths had occurred before the ration supplies had been depleted, causing authorities to theorize that Alfred had killed the men simply to rob them, and then lived in the shelter for months, leaving only to remove flesh from the bodies as and when he needed it. Upon returning to Alfred's temporary jail, they found him missing. To this day, it's still unknown exactly how he escaped, but it seems likely that he either bribed the guard or somebody else bribed the guard for him. He was not located until almost a decade later, on March 11, 1883, when he was approached by a man who was one of the party members who had chosen to stay behind at Chief Yor's camp. Alfred had been living under the alias of John Schwartz and was looking to buy supplies, but the man from the original party contacted the local sheriff, who arrested him. Once more in custody, Alfred signed another confession on March 16, stating that Shannon Bell had murdered all the men while he was off scouting for food. Upon his return in the late evening, Alfred killed Shannon in self-defense by shooting him in the stomach, then hitting him in the head with a hatchet. He then went on to build the shelter because of the bad weather, and claimed that while he repeatedly tried to make his way back, the weather was too uncooperative. He stayed in this makeshift shelter for 2 months, feasting on the bodies whenever he needed sustenance. Alfred Packer went through his first trial in April and was found guilty of the premeditated murder of Israel Swan. He was given the death penalty, but due to a technicality, he ultimately escaped this sentencing. Then in June of 1886, Alfred was tried again. This time, he was convicted of 5 counts of voluntary manslaughter and was sentenced to 40 years in prison. Around this time, it was revealed by local hunters that while the winter of 1874 had been harsh, the wildlife had been plentiful, throwing Alfred's argument that game was scarce completely out of the window. In 1901, after serving 18 years in prison, Alfred was granted parole. This came about as the result of a local newspaper, the Denver Post, printing several reports on how he was a decent man who had only done what he did to survive, and that the public had villainized him simply for trying to live through a harsh winter. The stories resonated with locals, who began to petition for his release. Eventually, Governor Charles Thompson relented to the pressure, and while he did parole Alfred, he refused to pardon him. After being released, Alfred went on to work as a ranch hand and a guard at the Denver Post. He died on April 23, 1907, aged 65, in Deer Creek, Jefferson County, Colorado. He was reportedly a charitable man who lived modestly. One neighbor recalled that Alfred once told him he had tried to eat human meat but had become ill from it, while another remarked on the unsettling quality of his piercing black eyes. Opinions about Alfred were divided after his release from prison. In 1980, a judge reportedly attempted to have Alfred pardoned posthumously, but the effort failed. Investigations in the 80s and 90s still have not reached a definitive conclusion regarding what truly occurred during those 2 months in the mountains. While a 1994 study revealed that Shannon Bell had a bullet wound to his pelvic area, it doesn't conclusively confirm that one of Alfred's accounts was accurate. It's possible that Shannon was shot upon returning to camp, only to discover that Alfred had killed the other members of the party. The case of the Colorado cannibal continues to captivate many, and the debate over Alfred's innocence or guilt remains unresolved to this day. Ultimately, we may never know for certain what transpired between February 9th and April 16th, 1874, in the San Juan Mountains. Moving on to the next case. Andrew Carnegie Whitfield. Andrew Whitfield, the nephew of the renowned steel magnate Andrew Carnegie, was a Princeton University graduate, an experienced business executive, in 1938, and a skilled pilot with over 200 hours logged in his Taylor Cub monoplane. On April 17, 1938, Whitfield took off from Roosevelt Field on Long Island, heading to an airfield in Brentwood, about 22 miles away. The weather was clear and calm, and the flight was expected to take only about 15 minutes. However, Whitfield never reached his destination. When he failed to return to Brentwood, an extensive search ensued, but no trace of him was ever found. It was later determined that his plane had enough fuel to fly up to 150 miles. After his disappearance, it was discovered that on the same day, Whitfield had checked into a hotel in Garden City on Long Island under the alias Albert C. White. He paid $4 in advance for the room and never checked out. His personal belongings, including his passport, clothing, cufflinks engraved with his initials, 2 $6,000 life insurance policies in his name listing his wife, Elizabeth Hasseley Whitfield, as the beneficiary, and several stocks and bonds made out in Andrew and Elizabeth's names were left behind in the hotel room. Phone records also indicated that he called his home while his family was out looking for him. The telephone operator who took the call recalled hearing him saying something along the lines of, "Well, I am going to carry out my plan," after which he hung up. After this information was uncovered, police theorized that Andrew had committed suicide by deliberately flying his plane into the Atlantic Ocean. There is no concrete evidence to support this theory, though. A subsequent search of the waters surrounding Long Island found no wreckage from his plane. Additionally, Andrew was not facing any personal or business troubles at the time of his disappearance. He had married in 1937, just a year before, and had plans to move to Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, the same month he vanished. Following his disappearance, Elizabeth filed for desertion, but she later explained that she did so to help publicize his case, as she did not believe he had intentionally abandoned her. Over the years, many people across the United States claimed to have seen Andrew, including railway police in Council Bluffs, Iowa, who reported seeing a man resembling him in a freight car in 1939. The man was said to be wearing his flight suit and appeared unkempt and disheveled, but the sighting was never verified. In 1946, Andrew was declared legally deceased, and the case was closed. Moving on to the next case. Carlina White. On August 4, 1987, Joy White and Carl Tyson took their 19-day-old baby, Carlina, to Harlem Hospital Center in New York City after noticing she had a fever. As they worried about their sick child, they were comforted by a woman they believed to be a nurse. However, in the early hours of the morning, following a shift change at 2 a.m., Carlina disappeared. The infant had been receiving intravenous antibiotics, but at some point between 2:30 a.m. and 3:55 a.m., her four was removed, and she was taken from the hospital. Although surveillance cameras were present, the system was down at the time of Carlina's abduction. The only suspect was the woman who had consoled Joy and Carl, but they later discovered she was not a hospital employee, despite having been seen around the facility multiple times in the weeks leading up to the incident. A security guard reported that a woman matching her description left the hospital around 3:30 a.m., though she did not appear to be carrying a baby. It is believed that Carlina was concealed as the woman made her escape. The case of Carlina White quickly went cold. Meanwhile, she was raised in Bridgeport, Connecticut, just 45 miles from where her biological parents lived. Given the name Nedra Nance, she preferred to go by the nickname Nettie, and was brought up by Ann Petway, the woman who had abducted her from the hospital. Petway herself had a difficult upbringing. She was frequently beaten by her mother with belts and extension cords. In 1977, as a teenager, she spent several weeks in jail after being charged with larceny. Her criminal behavior did not end after she took Carlina. Throughout the girl's childhood, Petway was placed on probation multiple times and once pleaded guilty to embezzlement after stealing from a department store where she worked in North Carolina. She also battled addiction. She explained Carlina's appearance in her life to friends by having already planted the idea that she was pregnant. She told them she would be gone for a little while until the baby was born, and most assumed that Carlina was the product of Petway's on-again off-again relationship with a man named Robert Nance. Carlina graduated from school and eventually moved to Atlanta, Georgia with Petway. According to reports, she'd been suspicious of her mother for a long time. She couldn't see the family resemblance even though relatives referred to her as Little and was unable to get her driver's license as she didn't have ID. But despite niggling feelings, Carlina couldn't quite put her finger on what was missing between herself and her mother. It wasn't until February 2005 when she got pregnant that she became truly concerned. She needed her birth certificate in order to access healthcare from the state. But for days, Pet kept making excuses. Finally, she gave a birth certificate to Carlina, but it was determined by officials to be a fake. When Petway was confronted with this news, she admitted to Carlina that she was not her biological mother, and she claimed that her parents had abandoned her. 5 years later, at the age of 23, Carlina began trying to find where she came from. She initially restricted her search to Connecticut, not realizing that she'd been born in New York, but eventually widened the search. She scoured missing people websites and eventually discovered photos of an infant named Carlina White whose information had been posted to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. She noticed that the photos of Carlina resembled those of her own daughter, Simani. Driven by a need for answers, she reached out to the center's hotline and eventually made contact with Joy and Carl. Shortly afterwards, in January 2011, DNA confirmed that she was indeed Carlina White. Later that month, an arrest warrant was issued for Petway by the North Carolina Department of Correction for violating her probation following her conviction for embezzlement. 2 days later, on January 23, Petway turned herself into the FBI office at Bridgeport. She had driven to Connecticut to arrange care for her son, who was her biological child. Petway admitted that she was motivated to steal Carlina from the hospital after she'd endured several miscarriages, and she was distraught at the idea of never becoming a parent. If convicted for kidnapping, she would face between 20 years and life in prison. She declined to enter a plea at her arraignment at the U.S. District Court for Southern New York in Manhattan, but on February 10, 2012, she pled guilty to a federal kidnapping charge. Because she entered into a plea deal, it was recommended that she serve between 10 to 12 years in prison. She was 50 years old when she was convicted and sentenced to 12 years behind bars. Although her defense argued that Petway was a distressed and depressed woman at the time of the crime, the judge did not show leniency, stating that Petway's actions had caused a parent's worst nightmare for the couple. Petway was sentenced and served her time in a low-security facility in Alabama. She was released on April 14, 2021. Carlina, on the other hand, faced difficulties adjusting to the situation. After reconnecting with her biological parents, she became estranged from them but appeared to just need time to process everything that had happened. She found it particularly challenging to participate in interviews, as there was an expectation for her to have a certain type of relationship with her biological parents, who were strangers to her. However, over time, she began reaching out to them again. By 2014, Carlina maintained a relationship with both her mother and father. Although her legal name is Carlina White, she continues to go by the name Nettie, the name she had given herself in childhood, rather than the one given to her by her biological parents or Petway. Moving on to the next case. Cherry Jo Bates. Cherry Jo Bates was a vibrant and ambitious young woman, born in Omaha, Nebraska, on February 4, 1948. She moved to California with her family in 1957, where she quickly became known for her bright personality and achievements. At Ramona High School, she was a varsity cheerleader, active in student government, and an honors student. Her peers described her as sweet and outgoing, with dreams of becoming a flight attendant after completing her education. Cherry went on to attend Riverside College and worked part-time at Riverside National Bank. In 1965, after her parents divorced, Cherry moved in with her father. She was eager to pursue her future and build a career, but tragically, her life would be cut short before she could realize her dreams. On the morning of October 30, 1966, Cherry Jo Bates spent time with her father, attending Mass and sharing breakfast at a local restaurant. Later that afternoon, she made plans to go to the college library to work on a research paper. Around 3 p.m., she called her friend Stephanie, and again at 3:45 p.m., asking if she wanted to join her at the library, but Stephanie declined. It's believed that Cherry arrived at the library between 4:30 and 5 p.m. An eyewitness later reported seeing Cherry's distinct lime green Volkswagen Beetle leave her home around 6:10 p.m., heading in the direction of the library, with a bronze 1965 or 1966 Oldsmobile following closely behind. At the library, Cherry studied until around 9 p.m. A young man, described as being about 5 feet 11 inches and wearing dark clothing, was seen lurking near her vehicle and staring in her direction at around 9 p.m. Cherry's father waited up all night for her to return and even checked in with Stephanie, who confirmed that Cherry had no plans to stay out overnight. At 5:43 a.m. the following morning, Cherry's father filed a missing persons report. Less than an hour after Cherry's father filed the missing persons report, a groundskeeper discovered her body at 6:28 a.m., sprawled face down on a gravel path between two unoccupied houses near the college parking lot. The 18-year-old still wore her pale yellow long-sleeve blouse and faded red pants, and her woven straw bag lay nearby. There were no signs of sexual assault or robbery, but her clothing was bloodied and unchanged. She had been stabbed multiple times in the chest and left shoulder, with additional slashes to her face and neck. A cheap, paint-splattered Timex wristwatch was found about 10 feet away, with a 7-inch circumference. Investigators also discovered a peculiar footprint from a shoe sold exclusively in military outlets, likely linked to Leavenworth prisoners. From the onset, it was clear that Cherry had fought her assailant. Despite her small, 5 feet 3 inches frame, she had scratched at the attacker's face, arms, and head, and had managed to tear off his watch. Beneath her fingernails, fragments of skin and brown hair were found, indicating a violent struggle. Her autopsy revealed that Cherry had been repeatedly kicked in the head in addition to sustaining 2 wounds to her chest. The weapon used was described as being 1.5 inches wide and 3.5 inches long. The brutality of the crime became even more apparent when it was discovered that Cherry had cuts on her left cheek, upper lip, hands, and arms, as well as 3 slashes to her throat, which severed her jugular vein and larynx, nearly decapitating the young woman. Authorities found that her car's ignition wiring had been deliberately pulled loose, although the ignition key remained in place, and both windows were partly rolled down. Inside the car, 3 library books on the topic of the U.S. government were found in the front seat, along with smeared palm prints and fingerprints on the vehicle. The investigation was thorough, with numerous witnesses coming forward, creating a strong sense of confidence within both the authorities and the local community that the perpetrator would soon be caught. Within 24 hours, 75 individuals, including college students and members of the nearby Air Force Base, were interviewed. By November 6th, all but 2 individuals known to have been at the college during the time of the murder had been traced and eliminated as suspects. 2 separate witnesses also came forward, reporting hearing screams on the night of the murder, originating from the direction of Terracina Drive, where Cherry's body was discovered the following morning. Utilizing the coroner's expertise, investigators determined that Cherry was murdered around 10:15 p.m. on October 30th. To gather further information, Authorities organized a reenactment of Cherry's final moments in the library, hoping it would prompt a witness to come forward or reveal vital details. All participants, including 62 students, 2 librarians, and 1 custodian who had actually been in the library that night, were required to wear the exact clothing they had worn on the evening of the murder. Those with cars were also asked to park in the same spots as they had been on the night of the killing. Despite the meticulous reenactment, which aimed to trigger memories, no significant leads emerged from the event. Investigators theorized that Cherry's car had been tampered with and disabled to lure her away from it. They speculated that the killer may have offered assistance, leading Cherry to the dimly lit drive where she was attacked. The area was partly shielded from view by shrubbery, which could have provided some cover for the attacker. It was believed that after Cherry was forced from her car, the killer either stood by or sat inside the vehicle before ultimately dragging her to the murder scene. 1 month after the murder, 2 identical typewritten letters arrived at 2 separate locations. These letters, their contents unknown, may have held clues to the case, but they only added to the mystery surrounding Cherry's tragic death. One appeared at the Riverside Police Department headquarters, whilst the other turned up at the editorial offices of Press Enterprise, a local newspaper. The author of the letters described in detail of how he'd first disabled Cherry's car and then watched her attempt to start it until the battery died. He then offered his assistance, claiming his own vehicle was just down the street. Allegedly, after the 2 walked a short distance from the Volkswagen, the author said, "It's about time," to which Cherry replied, "Time for what?" Only to be met with his chilling response, "About time for you to die." He then proceeded to clasp a hand over her mouth and press a knife against Cherry's neck, forcing her to the dimly lit alley where he savagely beat her before stabbing and slashing her. Since the letters included details which hadn't been released to the press, investigators believe that the author could be the true killer. However, later DNA taken from the letters did not match DNA found under Cherry's nails. On April 30th, 1967, Press Enterprise printed an update stating that both police and Cherry's father had received handwritten letters which read, "Bates had to die. There will be more." However, police considered both of these letters to be a hoax. Many theorize that the death of Cherry Joe Bates is linked to the infamous Zodiac Killer, and that perhaps this was his first kill. The MO is similar to that of an attack on a couple in 1969, which was definitely carried out by the Zodiac. Further supposed proof that the Zodiac was responsible for the student's slaying is a desk found in the library inscribed with a macabre poem and graphic imagery about assaults upon young women with a bladed weapon. The inscription was discovered 6 months following Cherry's death and according to one handwriting expert is unquestionably the same handwriting as that in the Zodiac's letters, plus the letter sent to Cherry's father. Furthermore, a letter dated in March 1971, which the Zodiac wrote to the LA Times, took credit for the murder of Cherry. Outside of the Zodiac Killer, the only suspect in the case is a man referred to either as Bob or Billy and was named as a suspect around 1968 when an informant claimed that Bob was bragging about the murder of Cherry. Cherry and Bob had attended the same school together and dated in the weeks before her death until she returned from San Francisco where she'd gotten engaged to her steady boyfriend and broken off the courtship with Bob. Allegedly, the pair had had a public fight on campus during which Bob had struck Cherry just days before the killing. Then on the day of the murder, Bob was playing basketball with his friends before receiving a phone call from Cherry. He then left shortly afterwards. Another friend of Bob's came forward telling authorities that on the morning of the October 31st, Bob was crying and told the friends he had snuffed Cherry. Bob's family confirmed he had a Timex watch similar to the one found at the crime scene and that they never saw it again afterwards. It was also uncovered that Bob's sister worked at an Air Force base, and it's speculated she possibly gave her brother the shoes which matched the crime scene as a gift. Reportedly, witnesses saw 2 men at the crime scene with flashlights on the night of the murder, suggesting Bob may have had an accomplice. Despite the ongoing investigation and the troubling results from polygraph tests, no one was ever formally charged in connection with Cherry Joe Bates' murder. Her best friend, who had been questioned multiple times, failed a polygraph test and admitted to meeting Bob at a restaurant on the night of October 30th. Bob had allegedly requested a ride to campus to look for a lost item. However, the best friend denied any knowledge of the crime, and subsequent polygraph tests seemed to show he was truthful except for questions that could have implicated him in the murder. Despite this strong suspicion, the case remained unsolved. Cherry was laid to rest on November 4, 1966, in Crestlawn Memorial Park, where several hundred mourners, including her parents and older brother, gathered to honor her memory. The tragedy of her untimely death, coupled with the unresolved nature of her case, left a deep and lasting impact on her family and the Riverside community. Moving on to the next case. Dale Williams. Dale Williams, a 42-year-old man, was a dedicated husband and father to 2 teenage daughters. He ran an auto body shop in Nucla. On May 27, 1999, a motorist who was stranded reached out for help. Williams' friend, who was at the shop, thought the caller was a woman based on how Williams was speaking. Dale immediately left to assist the motorist, which struck his friend as unusual since Williams didn't work as a mechanic, but rather managed the auto body shop. The friend overheard Williams mention he would bring the wrecker but then changed his mind, stating he'd bring a pickup instead. Around noon, Williams stopped by a local office and told them he was on his way to help a stranded motorist less than a mile east of his shop. That would be the last time anyone confirmed seeing him. Later, Williams' wife called the shop after noon to check on his lunch plans, but no one answered the phone. At the time, his wife assumed he was busy at work and was not concerned. But when Dale didn't arrive home by the following morning, she reported him missing. A thorough search around Nucla failed to turn up any indication of Dale's whereabouts. Dale's friends and family printed missing posters and put them up all over town. However, 2 days later, posters left at the post office mysteriously disappeared and some of them were taken down by an unknown individual. A few more posters and a hidden camera was placed in the post office. A week later, it captured a photo of the man who tore down the flyers. He was a former friend of Dale and Diana Williams. A year before Dale vanished, he and Diana helped the friend's ex-wife leave Colorado, and they refused to tell him where she had moved. A month later, Dale found several disturbing items outside of his shop. Along with several torn photographs of the friend and his ex-wife, there were several .22 caliber bullets. A few days later, Diana made a strange discovery in the drop box at a video store she managed, a .22 caliber revolver. The gun, like the torn photos, had been stolen from Dale's shop. Police questioned the former friend about his involvement in Dale's disappearance, but he denied having any part in it. He was also able to provide an alibi for the day of the disappearance, which was confirmed. 6 weeks after Dale's initial disappearance, his truck was discovered submerged in 10 feet of water northwest of Nucla in July of 1999. The vehicle was located in a confluence of the San Miguel River and the Dolores River. Williams' wife viewed photos of the truck afterwards and noticed that the driver's side window was partially closed. She said her husband always drove with an open window. The ignition was turned on. It was in gear and the angle between the highway and the river was extremely sharp. Authorities suspect that someone intentionally drove Dale's truck into the river. Another strange aspect of the case is that a witness claimed to have seen Dale's truck back at the auto body shop at around 1:30 p.m., roughly 90 minutes after he had left to assist the motorist. Additionally, another witness reported seeing someone matching Williams' description at about 6 p.m. on May 27th at a market in Naturita, Colorado. However, investigators have been unable to verify either of these sightings. As of now, police have been unable to track down or identify the person who called for Dale's help. There have been no arrests made in the case, and Dale remains missing. Moving on to the next case. Diane Johnson. For most of society, parricide, the act of killing one's parents or close relatives, is one of the most unimaginable and heinous crimes. When these incidents occur, they quickly become high-profile, making it seem as though parricide happens frequently. However, FBI data shows that this type of crime constitutes only a small percentage of murders in the U.S. each year. Despite its rarity, it does happen, as unimaginable as it may seem. One such case involved Diane and Alan Johnson. On the morning of September 2, 2003, in Bellevue, Idaho, 16-year-old Sarah Marie Johnson was awakened by the sound of a gunshot at around 6:20 a.m. Startled, she looked out into the hallway and called for her parents, but received no response. Moments later, she heard another shot. In fear, Sarah fled the scene and ran to a neighbor's house, pleading for them to call the police. She explained hysterically that an intruder had shot her parents. When the police arrived at the Johnson family home, they were confronted with a grisly scene. Diane Johnson, a tax collector with a passion for cooking, had been shot once in the head while she was sleeping. She was still lying beneath the covers in her bed. Alan Johnson, a landscaper, had been shot twice in the chest and was found lying on the floor next to the bed. It appeared he had been in the shower when he was shot, as the shower was still running and there were blood splatters on the door and tiles. On the floor of the ensuite bathroom, a .264 caliber Winchester rifle was discovered. Since the Johnsons believed they lived in a safe neighborhood, they rarely locked their doors, which meant there were no signs of forced entry. Additionally, there were no signs of a struggle inside the home. Investigators then turned their attention to the guest house, which was rented out to a 45-year-old man named Mel Spiegel. Although Spiegel was nowhere to be found, the scope of the Winchester rifle was located on his bed, raising suspicions about his involvement in the crime. The weapon was quickly identified as belonging to the tenant, Mel Spiegel, who was found to have already left town by the time of the murders. Authorities locked down the street and halted the garbage truck that had begun its rounds to prevent it from collecting trash from the bin outside the Johnson home or anyone else's on the street. Inside the Johnson's bin, investigators found a pink dressing gown, one latex glove, and one leather glove. When speaking with other family members, the police became aware of the strained relationship between 16-year-old Sarah and her parents. This tension stemmed from the Johnsons forbidding Sarah from seeing 19-year-old Bruno Santos, her boyfriend, who was an illegal immigrant from Mexico. In the days before the murders, Diane and Alan had threatened to have Santos charged with statutory rape, which would have led to his deportation if he did not stay away from their daughter. As a result of this information, investigators turned their focus to Santos, believing he might be involved in the crime. Officers described him as cocky and confrontational during their questioning. Santos revealed that he had asked Sarah to marry him, and she had accepted. Authorities believed this gave Santos even more of a motive to want the Johnsons dead, as they would never have allowed Sarah to go through with the marriage. However, by this time, family members of the Johnsons were growing wary of the 16-year-old who did not appear to be grieving at all. In fact, she was more preoccupied with socializing and getting her hair and nails done than she was with mourning her loved ones. And Diane's sister noticed that she seemed to get annoyed at the mention of her parents. After telling their suspicions to the authorities, investigators began looking to Sarah as a potential suspect. As she used to clean the guest house for Spiegel on a regular basis, she would have known about the guns kept there. Diane's sister recalled that Sarah had asked for the key to the gun safe the day before the murders. When Sarah was brought in for questioning, investigators noticed the inconsistencies in her story. She told police that her bedroom door was closed at the time of the murders, but forensic evidence showed it would have been open, and so would the door to her parents' room. Furthermore, examination of the pink dressing gown found in the bin showed that there were hundreds of tiny blood splatter droplets on the back of the garment, as if someone had worn it back to front during the crime. Sarah's t-shirt, which she wore on the morning of the events, was also analyzed, and its fibers were matched to those found on the dressing gown. The latex glove recovered from the bin contained only the DNA of the 16-year-old, while both the leather glove and the robe had gunshot residue on them. Additionally, Sarah had bruising to her shoulder when she was first questioned following the murders, consistent with the injury one might sustain from the recoil of a rifle. Finally, it was found that the teenager had worn a shower cap to protect her hair. Thus, she had no blood on her when she went to the home of her neighbor. The cap had been flushed down the toilet and was found by plumbers a few weeks later after it caused clogging problems. In February, just 1 month after the slayings, Sarah Johnson was charged with 2 counts of murder, and she was charged as an adult. The prosecution and investigators believed that Sarah had thought she could use her parents' life insurance money and her inheritance to provide herself and her boyfriend a good life. Santos testified at the trial that the 16-year-old had told him how much she hated her father and had spoken about shooting him because he didn't like or approve of the couple's relationship. On February, Sarah was found guilty on both charges and sentenced to 2 concurrent life sentences without parole. A further 15 years were added to the sentence, as she was also convicted of a firearm enhancement charge. In 2012, Sarah's lawyers filed a petition for a new trial, claiming that she had received ineffective legal counsel during her original trial. The petition pointed out that there was an absence of blood splatter on Sarah at the crime scene and that the fingerprints on the murder weapon did not match hers or Mel Spiegel's. Instead, they matched those of another renter, Christopher Hill, who had no alibi for the night of the murders but had been ruled out of the investigation by law enforcement. Sarah's legal team argued that her original attorneys should have requested a delay to gather more evidence and had failed to adequately cross-examine 15 witnesses. However, in 2014, this request was denied. In 2017, Sarah attempted to have her life sentence reduced, but the sentence was upheld. During the trial, Diane Allen's son Matthew, who was attending university at the time of the murders, spoke out, saying, "I lost the 2 best friends I ever had. Judge, I would like to see the maximum sentence because after tomorrow, I don't want to have to hear about her or this event ever again. I feel she has no remorse and she would do it again." Sarah Marie Johnson is still serving her sentence at the Pocatello Women's Correctional Center. Moving on to the next case. Laura Kempton. 23-year-old Laura Kempton was found dead on September 28, 1981. She had last been seen in the early hours of that morning entering her ground-floor apartment on Chapel Street in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. Her body was discovered by a police officer who had arrived to serve a court summons for unpaid parking tickets. Noticing signs of a break-in at the front door and spotting a body through the partially open entrance, he entered the apartment. The crime was particularly brutal. Laura had been covered with a mattress and bedding, with her ankles bound by an electrical cord. She had been sexually assaulted before her death. Investigators suggested that a wine bottle was likely used in the attack at some point before, during, or after the assault. At the time of her death, Laura was a student at Portsmouth Beauty School, where she was training to become a hairdresser. She was also an employee at the Marco Polo gift store and Karen's Ice Cream Parlor. Hardworking and social, she was known to be a free spirit with a big personality. Investigators who began to look into her demise discovered that she likely died shortly after arriving home. She had suffered blunt force trauma to the side of the head. For weeks, detectives attempted to chase down leads and understand the murder, but weeks turned into months and months turned into years. Answers were still out of reach. The case went cold. Then in 2023, an announcement came. Laura's killer had been identified. Ronnie James Lee was a 21-year-old man living and working in Portsmouth at the time of the murder. Assistant Attorney General Rachel Harrington stated that there was no evidence suggesting that the two had known each other. Lee, born in 1960, briefly served in the military until 1981 before taking a job with MBI Security at Liberty Mutual in Portsmouth. In November 1982, he was arrested for theft while living with his mother. However, Laura's murder was not his only crime. Lee had a history of criminal activity, including multiple burglaries and a sexual assault conviction. He pleaded guilty to 2 of the 5 burglaries he was charged with. In 1987, he was convicted of sexual assault, which had resulted from another burglary, and served 3 years in prison. While he cannot be formally charged, investigators now consider the case solved. Lee passed away in February 2005 at the age of 45 due to acute cocaine intoxication. Had he still been alive, he would now be facing first-degree murder charges. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed exploring these intriguing cold cases with me. If you found the video fascinating, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to Cold Case Mystique for more deep dives into unsolved mysteries. Your support helps me bring you more compelling content. Leave a comment below with your thoughts or any cases you'd like me to cover next. See you in the next video, and remember, the search for truth never stops.